Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the sixth and final lecture of the 2020-21 series. And I suppose it's probably 8 if you count our joint ones with Laois Heritage Society. And you're all very welcome tonight. I know it's a beautiful night out and a lot of people would prefer to be outside rather than inside. So we won't delay. A couple of quick announcements beforehand on Zoom etiquette. Your microphones have been switched off. Please don't switch them on during the presentation. If you have problems with your signal, switch off your video. Questions will be taken at the end of the lecture, and if you have anything that is sort of striking you during it, put the question down in the chat feature if at all possible, and we can come back to it. I think, as many of you know, our very first lecture as the then Old Carlow Society was held on the 1st of May 1946. Exactly 75 years ago this month. So this is our 75th anniversary year starting. And one of the things we intend doing is doing a book on the history of the society. So if there's anyone out there with memories, or more importantly, one of our minute books that we're missing, get in touch with us and we'd be delighted to talk to you. That said, the success of the society is wholly dependent on our membership. And if you're not yet a member, please join us and support the work we do. Membership is actually quite cheap. It's only €15 a year. And you can join by sending your details and check into PO Box 162 Carlow, or you'll find on our website, carlowhistorical.com, details of how to join. Couple of other quick things. We're currently looking for articles for Carlow Vienna, our next edition, which will be published towards the end of the year. So if you've started an article, or if you feel like writing an article, get in touch with John Kelly. Again, you'll get the details on our website. The other thing, a quick reminder to people, on KCLR on radio on Tuesday evenings between 6 and 7, there's a program called The History Fix. Well worth listening to, and a lot of local Kilkenny and Carlow information. So we come to tonight's lecture. So first of all, I'd like to welcome Elaine Callinan. Elaine is a lecturer in modern history in Carlow College, St. Pat's. Her master's and her doctorate are both from Trinity College Dublin. Elaine's, I suppose, keen interest or special interest is in the political and military history of the 20th and 21st centuries, but especially around the revolutionary period of the early 20th century. And she focuses on political parties, how they campaigned, how they propagandized in those elections, and how, it was about winning at the ballot box in the early years of the founding, before the founding and after the founding of the Free State. So again, Elaine has presented numerous papers and written numerous articles on these subjects, and her book that she launched last year is called Electioneering and Propaganda in Ireland, Vote, Violence and Victory. If anyone doesn't have a copy yet, it's available from Four Courts Press at the princely sum of, I think, €40.50 currently. So, I'm sure Elaine will tell you other locations you can buy it in, but again, it's worth getting and worth having it. So over to Elaine herself for tonight's lecture, Electioneering, Propaganda in Ireland and Carlow, 1917 to 1921, Votes, Violence and Victory. Over to you, Elaine, and you're more than welcome.
Thank you very much, Pádraig, and good evening, everyone. And it's a great honour to be here tonight. And I'd like to thank the Carlow Historical and Archaeological Society for inviting me, and of course, all of you for tuning in. The aim of my paper this evening is to discuss the election campaigns that took place from 1917 to 1921 in Ireland. And I'm going to keep the focus as much as possible on Carlow. And I suppose the first question to ask really in all of this is, why are the election campaigns important during the revolutionary era? Because they're often overlooked in favour of the military happenings, but the two actually run in tandem. And one of the main reasons why they are important, generally speaking, is that elections can actually be turning points in history. And certainly the 1918 general election was one of those turning points. So taking the elections of these years together, we can see how people were motivated to engage in decisions that went on then to alter the course of Irish history. And propaganda and electioneering was used by politicians and political parties to promote their ideologies and influence the minds of ordinary people, people like you and me. And far more people were engaged in and affected by these political events rather than the military actions. So that makes them really, crucially important in terms of how the majority of people that were living on the island were thinking during this time. But in order to understand the election campaigns from 1917 to 21, we need to take a little bit of a step back to the formation of other movements in Ireland. And these movements became crucial in the battle for votes, particularly in 1918. So investigating their origins and rationale is important. The formation of the Ulster Volunteer Force in reaction to the Third Home Rule Bill sparked nationalists in Southern Ireland to consider their response. And a number in the Irish Republican Brotherhood believed a defensive Southern Volunteer Force should be organised. A small committee began to meet regularly in Dublin from July 1913, and on the 25th of November, an inaugural meeting for the formation of an Irish volunteer force was held in the Rotunda Rink in Dublin, where about 4,000 enlisted. The Irish Volunteers, or Eogaid na hÉireann, declared that its primary aim was to secure and maintain the rights and liberties common to the whole people of Ireland. Irish volunteer companies began forming in Carlow by early 1914, as can be seen in the witness statement of John McGill of Palatine in Carlow, and he recalled that he joined the Rathvilly Company at its formation in 1914. He explained that the company was drilled by an ex-British soldier named John Foley, and even though they had no arms, they drilled with wooden guns, which he made in his workshop. And Patrick O'Kane from Tinner Island stated that he joined his local National Volunteers in 1913-14, where they were trained by a competent reserve sergeant named O'Brien. Now, O'Brien, at the outbreak of the Great War, enlisted in the British Army, and he was subsequently killed at the Battle of Mons. One of those also signing up in November 1913 was Michael O'Hanrahan. And O'Hanrahan had moved with his family from New Ross to Carlow, where they lived at 91 Tullow Street. O'Hanrahan was educated at Carlow Christian Brothers School and then attended Carlow College Academy. And in 1898, he joined the Gaelic League, and in 1899 founded the League's first branch in Carlow, becoming its secretary. He was proficient in Irish and taught Irish classes for the League at Carlow's Catholic Institute. And from around that time, he then tended to use the Irish form of his name, Micheál O'Hanrahan. So with his brother Henry, he also founded the Workmen's Club on Brown Street. Now, I know most of you are aware of all that, but it shows like Carlow connections into even the higher echelons of the Irish Volunteers. But not to forget the women, because a number of nationalist women set up Cumann as an auxiliary to the Volunteers on the 2nd of April 1914, merging with and dissolving Uí na hÉireann. The primary aims of this organisation, as stated in their constitution, were to advance the cause of Irish liberty and to organise Irish women in the furtherance of this object, to assist in arming and equipping a body of Irish men for the defence of Ireland, and to form a fund for these purposes to be called the Defence of Ireland Fund. And in Carlow, a meeting of the newly formed branch of Cumann was held in mid-August 1914 with a large attendance of members. Miss Elizabeth Bloxham from headquarters had attended the meeting and addressed the audience, stating that the institution of Cumann was precisely the same as the National Volunteers so far as the admission to membership was concerned. So in that regard, there's evidence of an attempt at equality even at this stage in Irish military happenings. She explained that members of Cumann wanted women who would not only do ambulance and first aid work, but those who would do any work that might be demanded of them for the national good. So again, it's hinting at the fact that women were not just going to be the domestics, if you like, of the revolutionary movement or any military movement. They were going to get their hands dirty in terms of maybe even engaging in battle. So there, when we look at this, by 1914, then we have two volunteer forces existing in the country. One pledged to defend Home Rule and the other pledged to resist it. So Ireland was on the brink of civil war. The outbreak of the Great War and Britain's declaration of war against Germany in August 1914 turned everyone's attention to Europe. War also led to the introduction of the Defence of the Realm Act, also known as DORA for short, on the 8th of August 1914, giving the British government wide-ranging powers, including the provision to court-martial civilians breaking wartime rules, where the maximum penalty was death. Newspaper reports revealing Carlow's sentiments stated that we in Ireland hope that England and France will be victorious. Germany is no respecter of nationality. So we can see where the sympathies, if you like, of Carlow lay at the time. On the 17th of September 1914, this is a month after Britain's entry into the war, the Home Rule Bill passed into law. Now, it had a suspensory bill for the duration of the war and a clause for Ulster at the time. But all eyes were now turned to happenings in Europe, so much so that the RIC inspector in Carlow stated that the most striking feature that month was the utter absence of interest on the part of the people at the placing of the Home Rule Bill on the statute book. Later in September, John Redmond, who was then leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party, heard of a volunteer meeting at Wooden Bridge while driving with his wife to his home in Aughvanna in County Wicklow. And he immediately detoured to make a speech, receiving a warm reception from the volunteers. He stated that it was the duty of the volunteers to account yourselves as men, not only in Ireland itself, but wherever the firing line extends. So originally, the volunteers were to defend the coastline of Ireland, but at this speech in Wooden Bridge, he extended that to maybe Irish volunteers serving or enlisting in the Great War. Members of the original committee of the Irish Volunteers disagreed with the statement at Wooden Bridge. They quickly issued a manifesto declaring that Redmond had announced a policy that was fundamentally at variance with their own published and accepted aims and objects. This manifesto had stated that Ireland cannot, with honour or safety, take part in foreign quarrels otherwise than through the free action of a national government of her own. This difference of opinion caused a split in the Irish volunteer movement. Just prior to this split, a list was drafted by John Redmond and John Dillon to work out numbers. And according to those, from Redmond were 158,360, and for Professor O'Macneil, there was 12,306. Now, when you read history books or other sources, you get similar figures on this, but there's slight differences in the totals. But overall, the ratio remains the same. And in Carlow, the strength of the volunteers in October 1914 was 2,581 out of a total county population of 36,327, of which 32,127 were Catholic and more likely to be nationalist. And out of the 500 that attended volunteer meetings at the time, it was gauged that 491 supported Redmond and 9 supported Macneil. So what this tells us or demonstrates is that Redmond was largely supported by the Irish and Carlow nationalist population in 1914. Trepidation and excitement about the Great War increased and war coverage swelled in all the newspapers, including the Nationalist and Leinster Times, which I'll call the Carlow Nationalist for convenience from here on. Towards the end of August, this newspaper reported that fully 2,500,000 men are now about to engage in battle. The line reaches nearly 300 miles. They also reported that British troops are now taking part in the great battles now waging on the Belgian, French, German frontier. A large contingent of Irish troops arrived with the English troops during the week. But by 1916, the heavy death toll on the Western Front led to diminished recruits and provided fodder for anti-war and anti-recruitment campaigns. Difficulties at home created a variety of problems for John Redmond and the Irish Parliamentary Party. The issue of conscription dogged the party throughout the war years and went on to become a contentious issue in election propaganda in the by-elections of 1917-18 and the 1918 general election. But I'll discuss that a little bit more later on. The threat of conscription was only one factor which affected life in Ireland and the Great War. Prior to the enforcement of conscription, a new nationalist party with separatist tendencies had emerged called Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin had formed in 1907 as a result of a merger between Arthur Griffith's Cumann na Gael and the Ulster-based Dungannon clubs, which in turn merged with the National Council, which had also been founded by Griffith. In its nascent years, Sinn Féin combined an assortment of diverse beliefs and traditions that fused, sometimes affably, sometimes antagonistically, into a party to attain self-government for Ireland. Originally, Griffith's Sinn Féin advocated for a form of self-government that mirrored Grattan's Parliament in the 18th century, but comprising a more inclusive amalgam of Catholic and Protestant members. So initially, Sinn Féin was a small monarchical party that sought independence within a dual monarchy system. Griffith's aim was to win over the Irish Parliamentary Party and Unionists to his line of thought, rather than vie against them or create a new party. But the Easter Rising in Dublin in 1916, and particularly its aftermath, was the moment in Irish history that began a regeneration of separatist sentiments and aspirations. However, Sinn Féin evolved during the election campaigns of this era into a separatist nationalist and Republican party. The leaders of the Rising had known they had little hope of military success. Their eschatology of blood sacrifice, theatrically played out in Sackville Street, or O'Connell Street as we call it today, initially brought scorn and rejection from the population, whose streetscape and businesses were in ruins after the battle. Reports in the Carlow Nationalist and resolutions in Carlow County Council initially condemned the Easter Rising and reasserted their faith in constitutional nationalism and the leadership of John Redmond. The newspaper commented that we pointed out in language by no means ambiguous that constitutional nationalism had not failed, whereas the physical force movement has been destined to failure. When writing these words, we had not the slightest idea that the small movement that had been working in antagonism to national parliamentarism would result in a practical siege of Dublin and the ultimate partial ruin of our proud capital. We can only express our regret that the thing has occurred and hope, sincerely hope, that good, not bad, for the future of our poor country will come out of it. Carlow Urban District Council at their meeting on the 9th of May expressed their regret and abhorrence at the appalling crime of the recent events committed in Dublin and other places, and renewed their confidence in John Redmond. They also expressed their deepest sympathy with the people of Dublin in the great calamity which had befallen them. However, by mid-May 1916, with the court-martials and execution of the Rising's leaders, and with the arrest of over 3,000, appeals for leniency began. The chairman of Carlow Urban Council announced that he wished to propose the following resolution. That feeling convinced that the evils of justice have been amply met, we further add to the resolution unanimously passed by the board on the 8th, that the government be asked to extend clemency to those connected with the recent rebellion in Dublin and other parts of Ireland, believing as we do that any further extreme measure will only tend to exasperate the people who never had any sympathy with the movement and the misguided men who led it. The resolution was put to the meeting and passed unanimously. In the weeks and months following the Rising, the mindset of many in Ireland began to change. Like many counties outside Dublin, Carlow only had a limited involvement in the Easter Rising, mainly through some of her past and contemporary natives. In the following years, particularly during the War of Independence and Civil War, a stronger volunteer organisation formed in the county and played an active role. As stated at the beginning, these volunteers were involved in electioneering during this era also. Volunteer companies in Carlow began forming in earnest in 1917. For instance, Michael Doorley, in his Bureau of Military History witness statement, explained that he joined the Bagnallstown Company of the Irish Volunteers at the end of 1917, when there were already about 35 men in the company. In 1918, Doorley organised a section of volunteers at Nerney, which was originally attached to the Bagnallstown Company. By April 1918, membership had increased so much in Nerney that the company separated and became known as E Company 1st Battalion Carlow Brigade. Their main duties were drilling and training, and their principal activity was organising resistance to conscription. However, when the threat of conscription passed in 1918, their members, like many volunteer companies across Ireland, dropped by half. During the 1918 general election, some of the first active duties of the Irish volunteers was canvassing or forming peace patrols and conveying voters to the polls. There were 103 constituencies with 105 seats in 1918, but 25 constituencies were uncontested, giving the Sinn Féin candidate a walkover. The total electorate in contested constituencies in 1918 was 1,462,895. Voter numbers increased in 1918 because of the Representation of the People Act and an absence of long-term emigration opportunities due to the war. The enfranchisement of women over 30 years with some property qualifications also affected the election outcome. The Freeman's Journal reported that the women's vote is a new factor in the election campaign, and as it roughly represents from 40 to 50% of the electorate, it will exercise an enormous influence on the result of the elections. Evidence of the high turnout by women was in the newspaper reports that consistently commented on their predominance at the polls. For instance, the Irish Times stated that from all quarters, women voted in large numbers and early in the day, and in Belfast, women also voted in larger numbers than was generally anticipated. This did not bode well for the Irish Parliamentary Party, who now had John Dillon as their leader because Redmond had died in March 1918. The Irish Women's Franchise League at their meeting accused Mr. Dillon's party of being from the beginning hostile to their league. They reminded that Dillon had previously stated that he hoped women would never get the vote as it would mean the disturbing of Western civilization. Voter turnout at the 1918 election was also affected by the absence of those still trying to make their way home from the Great War, those that had died during the war, and the influenza pandemic in 1918-19, which, according to my Carlow College colleague, Dr. Ida Milne, killed at least 20,057 people and infected an estimated 800,000 people on the island. There were also accusations of personation and falsifying the register of electors during the elections in this era, but all parties engaged in the practice, so they more or less cancelled each other out, except perhaps in the 1921 Northern elections. Carlow had been a nationalist stronghold for many years, but lack of organisation in the county and altering views proved too strong to uphold the Irish Parliamentary Party in 1918. At a meeting of the Carlow Nationalist Election Committee in December 1918, which was chaired by Michael Governy, a resolution was proposed and unanimously passed, which commented on the poor state of the Irish Parliamentary Party organisation in the county. This led to the following resolution. In view of the lack of nationalist organisation in the county and the impossibility of re-establishing it in the interval before the election, and thus ensuring an effective canvass of the electors, we think it inadvisable to continue in the electoral contest. Reporting on the reasons for this decision, the Freeman's Journal stated that there was no mistaking the conviction under which the young men and the workers of Carlow were going to vote. They believed in the reality of the Republican policy and they were going to vote straight for the Republic. Now, this is not to say that everybody in Carlow had suddenly switched and become great Sinn Féin supporters. In fact, there was little alternative for them at this stage. There was no unionist candidate put forward for Carlow, and Labour had withdrawn from the 1918 election, so there was no Labour candidate either. So they were left with the unopposed Sinn Féin candidate, who was James Lennon, but he was in Belfast jail for the election, and the Irish Parliamentary Party candidate backed out on nomination day. So leading Sinn Féin figures came to Carlow to carry out election speeches on behalf of Lennon, such as, for example, Father Michael Flanagan, who the Carlow Nationalists referred to as Ireland's great patriot priest. The high ideals were the fundamental motif of a political party and were transmitted to create and persuade acquiescence to a common wisdom in order to attain hegemonic domination. For the Irish Parliamentary Party, it was Home Rule. For Sinn Féin, it was abstention from Westminster. And for Unionists, it was maintaining the legislative union between Britain and Ireland. These were the mainstay topics of political propaganda, and particularly of election speeches during all elections from 1917 to 21. In Carlow, election speeches by both nationalist parties, this was prior to the Irish Party withdrawal, were held near Shamrock Square, and most had an enthusiastic crowd with little or no disorder. A good example is the opening of the election campaign in Carlow in November 1918, where opposing crowds were addressed by speakers from wagonettes, which were about 20 yards apart. However, when these meetings were about halfway through, the Nationalist newspaper reported that the wagonette containing the Sinn Féin speakers moved further away from the Irish Parliamentary Party and brought the majority of the people with it. However, there were supporters of the Irish Parliamentary Party, and one was the Reverend Dr. Patrick Foley, Bishop of Kildare and Leitrim Diocese, who made a speech in favour of the Irish Parliamentary Party, stating, "I have no faith in Sinn Féinism as a policy, nor in abstention from Parliament as a means of political salvation." At the same meeting, the Irish parliamentary candidate, Mr. Donovan, stated that he stood for the largest measure of freedom that could be gained for Ireland without civil war and without partition. And the crowd cheered at that statement. He claimed that it was a suicidal policy for Ireland to be without representation of the old kind at a moment when the Peace Congress is assembling to decide the future map of Europe. Donovan spoke strongly about partition, saying, "They were now threatened, not with temporary partition or permanent partition, not with setting up Ulster as a self-governing unit, but they were threatened with the proposal that Ulster should be torn away and annexed and converted into a shire of England." A voice in the crowd at this stage shouted, "Never." Donovan's concern about Sinn Féin's policy of abstaining from the Westminster Parliament was that Ireland would have no political voice in a post-war world where taxation issues to pay for the war were going to be decided. And as he stated himself, a monstrous proposal was going to be made. They were told Ireland was to have no representation but the representatives of Orange Ulster. And he argued that that policy of abstention was never part of the policy originally of the men who fought in Easter Week. It was afterwards that that policy was drafted into their propaganda. The original idea of the National Volunteers and the Irish Volunteers was that they should go out and defend the fruits won by constitutional action. Donovan had supported Redmond's war efforts, stating, "Mr. Redmond went honestly to war, believing that when they won the fight for the freedom of France and Belgium, they were delivering a good strike in the cause of Ireland." He did not support advocating for a republic because he thought Europe and Ireland had enough bloodshed and wanted a peaceful solution, and did not think that the difference between Dominion independence and sovereign independence was so great that it was worth civil strife of the bitterest kind. Now, it's also important to note that there were a lot of enlistments from Carlow into the Great War. And certainly if you go out to the lovely monument in Loughlin Bridge, you can see all those who died in the war as a result of enlisting from Carlow. So it's important to remember that when we look at Carlow during this time. But Donovan withdrew from the contest, and that just left Lennon really going forward for Sinn Féin. And Sinn Féin electoral propaganda in Carlow and across all of the constituencies was to promote abstention from Westminster if elected, and to appeal to the Paris post-war peace conference for recognition of Ireland's independence instead of to the British Imperial Parliament. And this was one of their really strong electoral messages. They also professed to be the inheritors of the spirit of the leaders of Easter Week, with the proclamation as their political guide. In reality, though, Sinn Féin had not organised the rising, but they had been blamed in the Irish and British media, and this was a charge that they happily appropriated. However, De Valera, in an election address in County Clare, immediately sought to sway opinion from blood sacrifice in the pursuit of independence to success at the ballot box, stating, "Every vote you give now is as good as the crack of a rifle in proclaiming your desire for freedom." Easter Week became the exemplar for Sinn Féin candidates and their supporters to award legitimacy to the bloodshed of Easter Week. But they did walk a tightrope of praising the rising and ennobling its rebels, while seeking an electoral mandate to pursue political ends and international recognition of their claim for a republic. But De Valera gradually rehabilitated the Easter rebels from belligerents into political martyrs. The regeneration of Sinn Féin as a respectable political entity, while still retaining its connection to the heroic martyrs of Easter Week, was masterfully choreographed. fine-tuning this message throughout 1918 by sharpening the abstentionist policy and then wedding it to an appeal for Ireland at the Paris Peace Conference, whether that was attainable or not, captured many voters. During all of the by-elections and general election campaigns, the Irish Parliamentary Party continuously vilified Sinn Féin's Easter Rising rhetoric. Voters were asked if they favoured a party of physical violence over a constitutional settlement. They used broadside posters with large black type that claimed clerical endorsement and condemned Easter week, such as the one that I'm showing you there in the far right of the slide, which refers to Sinn Féin as the physical farce party or the party of violence and intimidation. And then you can see the mid one, that's another Irish Parliamentary Party poster there for the by-election in South Longford. And they've piled all the parties that are against them into the dustbin and they're closing the lid on it, saying rubbish may be shot here. So you can see, you know, the violence even in the wording of some of the politics during this time as well. And the poster on the very far left, put him in to get him out. This was used again and again for all the different Sinn Féin candidates in contested constituencies. And in this, I suppose you could argue that Sinn Féin mounted an advertising campaign, a political advertising campaign, which I would argue was one of the first ever in the country, and it worked very, very well for them. And what they're showing here is technically a Sinn Féin rebel in prison outfit. And today that might not make much sense to us, but back then to the voters at the time, they would have read that as put him in government to get him out of jail. So the message was very strong: vote for the Sinn Féin candidate, get him out of jail, and we'll make changes within the country. And that's where the line, the man in jail for Ireland, comes, if you like. So, but the Irish Parliamentary Party continuously argued against this type of campaigning and against this type of message. But the poor election results for the Irish Parliamentary Party proved that their condemnation of the Easter Rising did not serve them well at all. Now, this again is not to suggest that those who voted for Sinn Féin in Ireland or even acquiesced to the candidate in the uncontested constituencies condoned a return to violence, because the motives behind voting during this time had many, many strands. And any idea of a return to violence was not suggested in any of the political parties' propaganda. So no one giving a vote in 1918 had any idea that the likes of the War of Independence was hurtling down the line. So it's just important to note that. But another big concern by all parties was the effect on Ireland by the threat of conscription, which I mentioned briefly earlier. Even though Ireland was exempt, rumours of conscription being extended to Ireland began when the Military Service Act was passed in Britain in 1916. And alarmed by the possibility that conscription might be extended to Ireland, Irish Parliamentary Party supporters and candidates began to emphasise voluntary enlistment and condemned any form of a draft throughout the by-elections. The Irish Parliamentary Party's attempted hardline stance on conscription, though, became utterly undermined when the coalition Prime Minister, Britain's Prime Minister David Lloyd George, extended the Military Service Bill in 1918 and introduced conscription to Ireland. And he did this to facilitate the raising of a further 555,000 men for the war effort, of which 150,000 were expected to come from Ireland. Damage limitation was sought by the Irish Parliamentary Party through withdrawing in protest from the House of Commons and going on platforms then with Sinn Féin, the Roman Catholic bishops and priests, trade unions, and some Protestant groups to oppose conscription. This extreme outrage was largely due to the fact that implementation of Home Rule had been linked with the dual policy of enacting the Military Service Bill. So with the combination of Redmond's death in March 1918 and the failure of the subsequent Irish Convention to try and work a way forward for Home Rule, voter confidence in the Irish Parliamentary Party plummeted. Conscription also placed the Irish Parliamentary Party, who had been at the vanguard of wartime recruitment and the war effort, in condemnation of government policy. Yet, recruitment posters and advertisements with Irish Party candidates' names still bedecked towns, villages, railway stations, shopfront windows, and newspapers. As the historian David Fitzpatrick stated, recruits rushed to enlist, but not to the army, rather into Sinn Féin and the Irish Volunteers. But as I previously stated, once the threat of conscription ended, many left the volunteer forces. In the 1918 election campaign, battle lines were drawn to attract voter recognition for being the party that ultimately prevented conscription being enforced in Ireland. The Irish Parliamentary Party claimed it was their strenuous opposition that stopped conscription in Ireland. Sinn Féin argued that it had been the actions of Easter week. The Irish Volunteers and Cumann na mBan and the Ancient Order of Hibernians played a strong role in the election campaigns of 1918 and in the Northern elections in 1921 by distributing election literature and in canvassing for their political candidates. The door-to-door canvass was an essential component for checking the register of electors, for face-to-face contact by a candidate or a candidate's representative, and to ensure that a voter could be relied upon to attend the poll. Now, bear in mind, we didn't have the same amount of polling booths or polling stations back in 1918 that we did today. There was often quite a distance to travel to cast your vote. Volunteers also acted as protectors for canvassers. Seamus Hennessy in East Clare described volunteer duties during the campaign for De Valera, stating that they escorted canvassers, protected and guarded supporters during rallies and election meetings, and visibly attended polling stations. At the outset of the election campaign, volunteer companies in Carlow had taken an active part during the 1918 general election on behalf of Lenin. They organised public meetings, distributed literature, posted up advertisements, and canvassed the electors. However, Carlow volunteers had no election in their constituency due to the withdrawal of the Irish Parliamentary Party candidate, but they travelled then to nearby constituencies in other counties to assist them in their election campaigns. During these campaigns, there were often instances where the Irish Volunteers and the Hibernians clashed violently, and Waterford City was a good example of this during 1918. On Thomas Street at the Volunteer Hall, Hibernians attacked and volunteers retaliated. The arrival of the police with fixed bayonets quelled the attacks, but the result was that 6 soldiers home on leave and 5 volunteers ended up in the infirmary. The political contest in 1918 resulted in 73 seats for Sinn Féin, 25 for Unionists, 1 independent Unionist, and 6 Irish Parliamentary Party MPs, or 7 actually if you include the MP for Liverpool, T.P. O'Connor. However, it is important to note that the voting method used was the first past the post method. This is where you put an X opposite the candidate that you support and the winner takes all. Driven and aggravated by a ruthless Sinn Féin electioneering and propaganda campaign, the Irish Parliamentary Party was outwitted and overcome in most constituencies in Ireland. This enabled the Sinn Féin claim that the majority in Ireland's 3 southern provinces of the national plebiscite, held under British law and British supervision, indicated the will of the Irish people as to the government under which they live. But if Ulster's results are added, and we have to bear in mind that this was an all-Ireland election, then the claim of a homogenous desire for self-determination does not hold up. Unionists in Ulster followed instructions to vote solidly for their own candidates to maintain the union and establish a policy of material progress in 1918. Although this is a generalisation, the results portray the success of Unionist candidates, and there's no denying their determination. Furthermore, if the total votes for Irish Parliamentary Party candidates, the low turnout and the absent votes are calculated, and the method of the first past the post voting system are taken into consideration, Sinn Féin's landslide victory is questionable. The proportion of votes attained in an all-Ireland context gave Sinn Féin only 46.9% of the total vote, Unionist 28.5%, and the Irish Parliamentary Party 21.7%. Now, this does not take into account the uncontested constituencies of which Carlow was one. And although some argue that these would have been Sinn Féin constituencies, we'll never know because no elections took place there. Dáil Éireann was formed in January 1919, and the elected delegates perceived themselves as representatives of the Irish people. Convening the first Dáil was Sinn Féin's commitment to the election promise of abstention from Westminster, although they will be unsuccessful at gaining entry into the Paris Peace Conference. In 1920, the local government elections were held, and this was the first time that the proportional representation system of voting was used. And this is the system that we use in Ireland today. During these local government elections, the intermittent invocation of the Easter rebels and their sacrifice for a republic remained in Sinn Féin propaganda, but it was transformed to fit the desire or need of the political elite to control councils and parochial interests. Life's mundanities became the backbone of electoral propaganda content. Housing, farming, and general taxation had been propaganda tools in 1918 as the election date loomed, but they took prominence in 1920, as did the cost of rates and local public services, such as parks and amenities. Housing is a good example of everyday issues propaganda, and public concerns over housing unsettled Southern politicians and sparked debate and passion. A letter to the Limerick leader condemned the wretched housing of the working classes and the scourge of profiteering. It was claimed that high rates was killing the building trade and paralysing the investor. The solution proffered was to be our own landlords by purchasing our own houses, to have a direct interest in keeping down the rates. Now, if any of us are listening to the news these days, we can see that 100 years later, we're still making the same arguments over housing in Ireland. Taxation on farming was also a big propaganda tool because Ireland relied heavily on the agricultural industry, with 3/4 of the population living by farming. Most Irish farmers now own their own land, with some 11 million acres having been purchased as a result of the Land Acts of the late 19th and early 20th century. The Irish Parliamentary Party claimed it was they who had enabled the farmers to purchase their own holdings and secure decent cottages for the labourers to live in. Sinn Féin retaliated by criticising the Irish Parliamentary Party for levying high taxes on farmers. Farmers, your turn now, was their mantra. They promised Irish farmers they would only pay £4 at the most in taxation, rather than the £10 an Irish farmer was now paying. Again, the Paris Peace Conference was going to provide the answer, because Sinn Féin was to have behind them England's claim that the small nations of the world should be free. A claim before the powers of Europe, they argued, could allow for a constitution to be drafted that would provide relief from a ruinous burden of taxation. Considerable interest was taken in the Carlow urban elections, and from the opening of polling at 8 a.m. until the close of poll, the town hall, according to the Nationalist, presented an animated appearance. There were 27 candidates for the 18 seats. In Carlow North, there were 11 candidates for 9 seats, and in the South Ward, there were 11 candidates for 6 seats. And for Great Cullen, a separate electoral area, there were 5 candidates for 3 seats. The total number of voters in the register in Carlow North was 1,035, of whom 725 voted, with 27 spoiled papers, leaving the number of valid votes at 698. In Carlow South, there were 684 voters and 490 voted, with 13 spoiled papers, leaving the total number of valid papers at 481. In Great Cullen, there were 402 and 348 registered their votes, with 9 spoiled votes, so the total number of valid votes was 334. In June 1920, the Rural District Council elections took place. After these elections, Sinn Féin requested that rural councils pledge allegiance to Dáil Éireann, and Carlow was one of the 16 that did so immediately. Michael Governy had announced his conversion to Sinn Féin following a visit to Mountjoy Jail during the recent hunger strike that was organised in protest against prisoners being categorised as criminals. As a Sinn Féin candidate, he was re-elected chairman of Carlow Urban Council, and he acknowledged that the board was now comprised of different elements, political and otherwise. And of course, the different elements, if you look at both the urban and the rural results, I'll just flick back to the urban in a minute, is that if you look there, you see quite a mix of various different parties. You still have a constitutional nationalist, Sinn Féin, some unionists, and Labour. But you also have women there in Carlow North as well. So women on the urban councils was becoming a feature during this time. And then we move over to the rural councils. You can see a big change here, where all of those would previously have been N for nationalist, because of constitutional nationalists. A big change has been to Sinn Féin and Labour, predominantly in the rural elections. And according to Governy, the main issues that he believed faced Carlow at the time were housing and the water supply. The next big election to face Ireland was the 1921 partition election. And it was so dubbed because Ireland became divided between partitionists and anti-partitionists. Nationalists of both hues rejected partition, but many Ulster unionists were in favour of it. The Act for the Better Government of Ireland had received royal assent on the 23rd of December 1920 and came into operation on the 3rd of May 1921. In an attempt to minimise objections from the polarised position of nationalists and unionists, Britain's Prime Minister David Lloyd George had proposed two separate parliaments and governments, one for the 6 northeast counties of Ulster and the other for the remaining 26 counties of Ireland, and election dates were set for May 1921. The Act was sometimes described as a Fourth Home Rule Bill, but is better known as the Government of Ireland Act 1920. Alongside the creation of two parliaments was a proposal for a Council of Ireland, but this never materialised. Representation in all the provinces increased for these parliaments as the Act provided for 128 MPs from 28 constituencies for the Southern Parliament and 52 MPs from 11 constituencies for the Northern Parliament. And proportional representation voting system was used for both elections, was supposed to be used for both elections, as it had worked well in the 1920 local government elections. John Dillon, the leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party, admitted with some bitterness in a letter published in the national newspapers that the 1918 election results had shown that Sinn Féin was accepted by the Irish race all over the world, and they had provided a mandate for that party. So until he saw some substantial evidence of a change of mind on the part of the Irish people, of which there was currently no evidence, he believed that the most patriotic course was to maintain silence and to abstain from any attempt to interfere in public affairs. He remained steadfast in his belief that Sinn Féin was on the path of war between the two nations, whereas his party saw compromise and peaceful means. So to avoid disorder and bloodshed, he believed that no parliamentary party candidates should contest the elections for the Southern Parliament. The Labour Party also decided to take no part in the elections, and their reason was that they wanted to defeat the design of the British Prime Minister to divide the democratic forces. Eamon de Valera of Sinn Féin weighed up the arguments in favour of and against an electoral contest and arrived at the position that it was best to contest these elections even though they were orchestrated by Britain, because they would show unity of Republican sentiment, and to let go the elections by default could demonstrate that Sinn Féin had given way to partition. The Carlow Nationalists reported an extract from de Valera's proclamation that stated, "Dáil Éireann has given its sanction to the parliamentary elections now pending in order that you may have an opportunity of proving once more your loyalty to the principle of Irish independence." Voters were told if they cast in favour of a Sinn Féin candidate, they were voting for nothing less than the legitimacy of the Republic, for Ireland against England, for freedom against slavery, for right and justice against force and wrong here and everywhere. Sinn Féin met in the courthouse on the 12th of May in Carlow to select a candidate or candidates, because now Carlow and Kilkenny had become one constituency with 4 representatives. James Lennon, the existing member for Carlow, was unanimously selected, and after a long discussion, the decision was taken to send 3 delegates to the area convention in Kilkenny to see if there could be agreement on having a second member for Carlow. The withdrawal of the Irish Parliamentary Party and Labour and Southern Unionists resulted in no elections taking place in the 26 counties. So in every county and borough, 124 Sinn Féin candidates were returned unopposed. Only 4 seats were contested by Trinity College Dublin. In a report in the Nationalist on the 21st of May after the elections, it was claimed that none with any scintilla of nationality wanted the Partition Act. And they pointed out that it was indeed strange that the vast majority of unionists in this part of Ireland are opposed to any partition or indeed any scheme of national self-government that would not be a distinct improvement on existing systems in the country. Southern Unionists had not the least notion of sending forward candidates, although they may not be in sympathy with republicanism. In commenting on Dillon's refusal to put forward an Irish Parliamentary Party candidate, the reporter stated that many of Dillon's supporters, people with very little political instinct and with no national outlook, thought that their late leader was very unwise in not putting forward candidates. This newspaper actually saw Dillon's actions as patriotic because no national good could be gained in putting forward candidates for any constituency in Southern Ireland. Now, this does not mean that everyone in Carlow again supported Sinn Féin, although it appears that this newspaper was biased in their favour at the time. It certainly tells us that in Carlow, people, regardless of their political affiliations, were against partition and against having a Southern and Northern Parliament. In the end, the elections only took place for the Northern Parliament, and the overall final result was a unionist victory. This shows us that in 1921 in North East Ulster, opinion had not changed since the advent of the Third Home Rule Bill in 1912. The results of this election allowed for the formal opening of the Northern Parliament by King George V in Belfast on the 22nd of June, 1921. However, the King addressed only Unionist MPs because Sinn Féin and Nationalist MPs refused to take their seats in the new Parliament. The Anglo-Irish Treaty signed on the 6th of December 1921 stated that the Government of Ireland Act 1920 shall, so far as they relate to Northern Ireland, remain in full force and effect. And the outcome was the establishment of the Irish Free State and Northern Ireland. The leaders of political change during this era were the new elite, and their voluntary supporters, through their vigorous electioneering activities and propaganda messages, instigated a political upheaval in Ireland. Although partition divided the island in 1921 and opinions collided in a civil war from 1922 to 23, the elections of this era established Irish party systems and policy makers that influenced the political landscape north and south for decades. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elaine. That was a hugely interesting talk. I think everyone enjoyed it. And I'm just looking at our audience. We have a number of politicians and ex-politicians in our audience tonight. I'd especially like to welcome the Vice Chair of the Expert Advisory Group from the Centenary Commemoration, Dr. Martin Mansell, and a number of others who have joined us tonight. If there are questions, if you haven't got them in the chat, if you'd signify by either raising your hand or whatever, we'll take questions at this stage. Is everyone very shy, or are we just not getting around to it? It's such an interesting period in our history. I'm sure there are questions out there. What was really interesting for me was when you put up the Carlow Brigade and the areas that the Carlow Brigade covered, not just the county, but well into South Kildare, into Wicklow, and into other areas. And interestingly, in last Sunday, there was a commemoration in Barra House commemorating the Barra House ambush, which happened 100 years ago last Sunday, in which 2 volunteers lost their lives. And again, it's only one of many commemorations that we have seen in the last couple of months dealing with the volunteers of the Carlow Brigade. But it's amazing how far it stretched for what would we normally see a small county and that. So has anyone any questions?
That's an interesting observation, actually, Porrick, because if you look at the story of Carlow during even the 1641 rebellion, and then even if you look at it during this particular rebellious period, you see a lot of, of these volunteer movements working with each other in the border counties. So it does two things. It makes for very interesting material, but it tells us as well that doing a county study can be difficult because of the infiltration into other counties and other counties infiltrating into, say, Carlow. That sometimes you have to take a kind of more regional look at some of these things to get the full picture. So that is an interesting observation.
Okay, any questions? Just for anyone who missed parts of it, I know some people joined late, the YouTube video of this will be on our YouTube channel tomorrow. so you can pick up the bits you missed. So I don't see any questions. I think, Elaine, you've covered it so comprehensively. I think this is the first. I don't remember a previous lecture where we haven't had hands up and we haven't had long discussions from various people as to their views, as to their questions of you as the expert. I'm just keeping an eye to see, is there anyone? Look, if anyone, if they haven't managed to put it up on chat, if they wave their hands, if they're on video, we'd willingly take any questions at this stage.
Or just unmute yourself and talk if anybody wants to come in.
The other thing I'd say is it's a broad period, even though it seems like a small few years. Like from 1917 to 21, so much happened in that period. It's kind of hard to condense it even into a question sometimes, because you're trying to bring in so much.
Yeah, and it's an area that sort of we forget sometimes the parallels that are going on in Europe at the same time. And interestingly, where Sinn Féin were looking to the Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Versailles, which came out of it, one of the really interesting chapters for me, because of what I work at, in that particular treaty is there's a piece essentially on labour rights, including the right to equal pay for men and women, and that aspiration is stitched into part 13 of that. So, parallels here are quite interesting as to what's happening internationally, and then we tend to zone in on what's happening in our own country through a revolutionary period, and yet on a larger scale, and the Paris Peace Conference, and as I said, that whole thing of labour law and the right to maximum working hours, all that was written by an Irishman who was at the Paris Peace Conference. So yeah, it's interesting. We have, Fergal, do you want to come in with that question yourself there?
Yes, sorry for being late. There's Cockle football training. Thanks, Elaine, for the lecture, and I'll look at it tomorrow night on YouTube. Just, I know John Donovan gave a similar lecture a while back as well, and I know when that struck me at the time, rightly or wrong, was the fact that even you alluded to there, Elaine, about that some of the elections weren't even contested. And I'm just wondering, it's hard to, when you bear that in mind, is it when later on in the 20s when there actually were elections and splits, and is it better to do you get a clearer picture of how things stand in that context then, because there were so many uncontested elections in the early 20s or late 1919 and that?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting question, and the election that I'm inclined to use, if you like, to draw parallels with the 1918 election is actually the 2011 election, where we saw the big hit on Fianna Fáil as a result of the banking crisis and things like that. Really what was happening to the Irish Parliamentary Party in 1918 was kind of a very similar situation, but for different reasons. They were getting blamed, if you like, for the death toll in the Great War. They were getting blamed for, British government decisions that weren't allowing home rule to come in, for kind of, giving way to Edward Carson and James Craig up in Ulster and all of those kind of things, so that they were getting the hit that way. And what actually happened to the Irish Parliamentary Party was a little bit similar to what happened in Fianna Fáil, is they had a lot of retiring MPs that stepped down just as the election was about to take place. And there just wasn't enough time to find new people to fill those roles. So it left them in a bit of a bad situation in those constituencies. And they were disorganized at the time in terms of recruiting new and younger members into their organization. Now, people often comment on the fact that the Irish Parliamentary Party, they were all old and, worn out and that kind of thing. They weren't really. Yes, their leaders were older men. Like John Dillon was, I can't remember exactly now, but he was certainly in his mid to late 60s, and T.P. O'Connor was nearly going 70, if not 70 at the time. But when you look at the other politicians in the Irish Parliamentary Party, they weren't any dissimilar, for example, to unionist politicians of the time. Sinn Féin politicians were unusual in that they were young. But they were brand new into this whole world of politics. And they were coming from, completely different backgrounds. And, even at that, a few of them became nominated to run for constituencies unbeknownst to themselves. They'd learned it a little bit later that, oh gosh, I'm going to be nominated as a TD or an MP, whatever, at the time. So there was a lot of confusion that was going on in 1918, but the Irish Parliamentary Party really were too disorganized to fill the places of retiring MPs at the time. And they had quite a substantial amount of retiring MPs. So that was their biggest problem.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Elaine. I don't see any other queries. So I think, John Kelly, if I can go to you to propose a vote of thanks formally on behalf of the Society.
Question there from Seamus.
Just a question
Sorry.
from Shamey there.
Sorry. Do you want to read it?
Yeah, were there any other counties where the volunteers so resoundingly support Redmond during the split? Or was Carlow statistically at the higher end? And if so, were there any identifiable reasons for that?
Were there any other counties that supported Redmond at that? Yeah. So,
the level of support, Elaine, that
yeah.
Carlow had.
Now, I don't have the actual facts and figures in front of me, but yes, there would have been. Carlow was not unusual in regard to that in 1914. In fact, even if you look at the overall figure, and I'll just put it into easy sums, across the country, 160,000 volunteers supported Redmond and about 13,000 McNeil. So that'll give you some indication across the island, really, in terms of support for Redmond in the early years of the Great War. Now that will change a little bit as the war progresses. Think about Ireland in 1914 and, young men enthusiastically wanting to enlist in the Great War for a sense of adventure. You had PALS brigades, people working in factories, enlisting together and that kind of thing in 1914-15. And then the death toll starts to mount and rise, particularly after 1916 and particularly after the Battle of Somme. And then you see quite a substantial reduction in recruitment, and you also see a substantial reduction in support for enlistment into the Great War. Now, there's other reasons as well for that, rather than just the death toll too, but certainly in 1914, early 1915, that figure that I gave for Carlow would have been replicated practically across the country, to be honest with you. Does that answer the question now? I hope it does.
I don't see Shamey coming back on that one, so yeah.
It does, thank you.
Thanks, Shamey. John, if I can go to you to formally propose the vote of thanks then at that stage.
Thanks very much, Paul. And thanks, Elaine, for a really excellent and thought-provoking talk tonight. I'd just like to say, just as a background, and this is not going to be the lecture after the lecture, don't worry. We're in a golden era, really, of Carlow political history. You mentioned two people during the talk, Robert O'Donovan, who stood as the IPP candidate, and John O'Donovan brought out a book last year, An Accomplished Man, a biography of Robert O'Donovan. John is online tonight as well. And then, of course, Michael Governy, his grandson Eugene Carberry, in the last years also brought out an excellent biography of Michael Governy. So in terms of political writing, we really are in a golden era in Carlow. And of course, Elaine, your book is a must for anybody interested in the national and in Carlow, the whole political military nexus at that time. And that story, like the whole story of the country at that time, can't be told without those two sides. It's really excellent. Just a few things I suppose caught my eye was the personalities like that were involved, apart from say O'Hanlon, but Kane as well, and O'Brien who died in the war, Cumming the man. The women weren't just going to be supporters; they were actually going to be active in the struggle. And of course, that was borne out by the Barry sisters as well, who were very active in the struggle. And so I suppose just some little things that were interesting to me was the lack of interest in the public in the passing of the bill in 1914. Redmond's serendipitous arrival at Wooden Bridge. You know, what if you didn't go there that day? I know that's what do they call it? Alternative histories.
Counterfactual history, yeah. Or some say he didn't actually just happen upon that meeting. I'm giving it his way really that time, but some say that was pretty planned. But
counterfactual, that's what it is, yeah. And of course, the whole mission creep that brought the volunteers then into World War One. And what Shamie, the question asked, the overwhelming support for Redmond in Carlow, I suppose, wouldn't be a surprise for anybody who knows about Carlow and the nationalism in Carlow. But what was interesting was that in 1921, there's 1,500 volunteers, like, who were Republican volunteers to all intents and purposes, and there was only 1,000 volunteers from both sides in 1914, approximately 1,000. Norney having 2 companies of volunteers, like an area that size now, wouldn't even be able to field a football team. You know, it just shows that the level of support and interest in it. And of course, the 1918 election, I really enjoyed that. You really captured the nuances, that it wasn't just black and white. You know, all the things that were involved in it. And I really enjoyed the wagonettes. I just wondered, was there a bit of pushing and shoving going on there? I'd love to have been there on that day. And Father O'Flanagan in Carlow, and that he was a great patriot priest, but he sort of moved to a very Republican later in life. But the interesting about Father O'Flanagan from a Carlow point of view is he authored the Irish history of Carlow called Carlow, which was a national, it was a government sponsored project. They only did a couple of counties, but there is copies of it in the library, and it's called Carlow. So I'm not going to go any further than that, Elaine. I'd just like to say that it's great to have you here tonight, and you're a great member and a supporter of Carlow Historical and Archaeological Society and Carloviana. You're a great supporter, certainly, to my work in that regard, and a regular contributor. And I really enjoyed the talk tonight. On behalf of Carlow Historical and Archaeological Society, I'd like to propose a vote of thanks to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, John. That's the formal side over with. I just see a couple of very goodwill messages coming through on the chat to Elaine. Brida Roshta has Gaurav Milamagat, Elaine Lecht Intocht Brida. So thanks, Brida. And there's various other things. Anyone who'd likes to make a donation to the society, the PayPal link has just gone up on the chat. And as this is our last lecture of this series, our next lectures will start in the autumn as usual. And again, we'll aim to do kind of 6 or 7 over the autumn, winter, spring era. They will be on the 3rd Wednesday of the months, starting in the autumn at this stage. And again, if anyone, as I said at the beginning, wants to join us in memberships, they're more than welcome. So that's the formal side of it over. And thanks everyone for attending tonight. If anyone wants to chat amongst each other, the link will stay live for another while yet, and you're more than welcome to chat and discuss politics and revolution. Thanks everyone.